The child's screams shattered the dawn silence of Milbrook, like broken glass against stone. Helena Cross pressed her face to the grimy window of her jail cell, watching in horror as 7-year-old Sarah McKinnon convulsed in her mother's arms on the dusty street below. Each spasm of the little girl's body drove another shard of helpless agony into Helena's soul. This was the child she had delivered 3 years ago, whose first breath she had coaxed into tiny lungs, whose fever she had broken just last winter. "Sarah, please," Helena whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Fight it, sweetheart." But even as the desperate prayer left her lips, Helena recognized the terrible signs. The violent convulsions that arched the child's back impossibly. The foam bubbling from her lips like poison from a broken well. The way her pupils had dilated until only white showed in her young eyes. This was the 4th time in 10 days, the 4th child she had watched die while trapped behind bars, accused of the very murders she was desperately trying to prevent. Sarah's convulsions slowed, then stopped altogether. The sudden silence in the street below was more terrible than the screams had been. Mrs. McKinnon's keening wail rose like smoke from a funeral pyre, a mother's grief given voice in the harsh light of the Texas sun. The crowd's reaction was immediate and explosive. "Witch!" screamed Bertha Caldwell. Her face twisted with grief and rage as she pointed at Helena's window. "She killed another one. The devil woman killed Sarah. String her up." This from Tom Miller, whose own twins had died just 5 days earlier. His weathered farmer's hands clenched into fists as spittle flew from his lips. Why are we waiting for some fancy trial? We all know what she is. Helena watched in growing terror as the crowd's mood shifted from grief to murderous fury in the space of heartbeats. Faces she had known for 3 years, people whose children she had delivered, whose fevers she had broken, whose wounds she had stitched, now stared at her window with the kind of hatred usually reserved for rabid animals. "Look at her up there," called out Frank Garrett, whose 8-year-old son Thomas had been the first to die. "Watching us like a hawk watches prey. Probably planning who to murder next. My Jenny was supposed to be safe," wailed Widow Morrison, Sarah's aunt, her black dress already torn from clawing at her own face in grief. "She promised me my Jenny would be safe, and now—" Her words dissolved into sobs that seemed to echo off every building in town. Dr. Marcus Hayes knelt beside Sarah's still form in the center of the growing crowd, his weathered hands checking for a pulse that would never come. When he looked up at Helena through the window, she saw something that cut deeper than the crowd's hatred, disappointment, and betrayal in the eyes of a man who had once trusted her judgment completely. The crowd pressed closer to the jailhouse, their individual voices blending into a roar of rage and accusation. Helena could make out individual faces in the mob. There was Samuel Peters, the blacksmith, whose massive arms now gestured toward her window as he shouted for immediate justice. Beside him stood Mary Hutchinson, the schoolteacher, her usually gentle features contorted with a fury Helena had never seen before. "She's been poisoning our babies," Peters bellowed, his voice carrying over the crowd. "While we slept trustful in our beds, that witch was creeping through our homes, murdering our children." "Our 3 years," shouted another voice. 3 years we welcomed her into our homes, let her touch our little ones with those cursed hands." Helena stepped back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The sound of the crowd was growing louder, more organized, more dangerous. She could hear someone shouting instructions about finding rope, about not waiting for Judge Harrison to arrive from Austin. "Helena Cross," came Sheriff Tom Brady's gravelly voice from behind her. She turned to see the lawman standing in the cell doorway, his weathered face etched with the kind of exhaustion that came from watching a community tear itself apart. His hand rested on his gun butt, not threatening her, but ready for trouble from the street. "Tom, you know this is madness," Helena said, gesturing toward the window where the mob's roar continued to build. I've delivered half the babies in this town, sat with families through fever and sickness. Why would I hurt children? Brady's eyes were weary, but not unkind. That's what I keep asking myself. But Helena, you're the only one who's been treating these sick kids. You're the one who insisted on bringing your special medicines to each family. He shook his head slowly. Either you're the unluckiest healer in all of Texas, or I'm a murderer. Helena finished the thought he couldn't voice. Through the window, she could see the crowd had grown to nearly 50 people, almost a quarter of Milbrook's population. Someone had brought a coil of rope, and others were eyeing the sturdy beam that supported the jailhouse porch roof. Sheriff Brady. The voice that cut through the mob's roar carried the sharp authority of military command. Captain Jake Morrison pushed through the crowd, his cavalry uniform dusty from hard riding. He was Sarah's uncle, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and pale blue eyes that burned with a fury that made Helena's blood turn to ice. Morrison mounted the jailhouse steps, turning to address the crowd with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to command. Citizens of Milbrook. He called out, his voice carrying clearly over the noise. I understand your anger. I share your grief. That little girl who died today was my own sister's daughter, as dear to me as if she were my own child. The crowd's roar quieted to listen, though the tension remained palpable. Helena could see faces turned upward toward Morrison, hungry for leadership, for someone to channel their rage into action. But we are not a mob, Morrison continued. We are American citizens bound by law and justice. The woman in that cell will face trial for her crimes, and when she is found guilty, as she surely will be, she will hang according to proper legal procedure. Legal procedure. Tom Miller pushed forward, his face red with anger. My boys are dead, Captain, dead, because we trusted that witch with their lives. How much more legal procedure do we need? Legal procedure is what separates us from savages, Morrison replied firmly. However, I have news that may interest you all. I've received authorization from Fort Richardson to expand this investigation. The Army believes these poisonings may be part of a broader conspiracy, possibly involving hostile Indians. Helena felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Through the window, she could see the crowd's attention sharpen at Morrison's words, their anger finding a new focus. Indians, called out someone from the back of the crowd. What do you mean, Captain? Morrison's eyes found Helena's through the window, and she saw something calculating in his gaze. We have reports of Miss Cross meeting secretly with Comanche scouts in the hills east of town. She may be passing information about our defenses, our patrol schedules, even helping them identify the most vulnerable families to target. The crowd's reaction was explosive. Shouts of traitor and Indian lover filled the air, and Helena saw several men reach for weapons they carried. The distinction between witch and traitor might matter to military tribunals, but to a frontier mob, both crimes deserve the same punishment. Now, that's not true, Helena called out, but her voice was lost in the crowd's roar. The truth was far more complicated than she could explain to anyone in Milbrook. She had indeed met with Comanche in the hills, but not as a conspirator. 4 months ago, while gathering medicinal herbs in the desert, she had stumbled upon a wounded warrior named Natan. Instead of fleeing or raising an alarm, she had treated his infected arrow wound, probably saving his life. Their subsequent meetings had been brief, secretive, focused entirely on healing arts. He had shown her which desert plants could ease fever, which roots could stop bleeding, which berries could calm a racing heart. In return, she had taught him to recognize symptoms of diseases common among white settlers. It had been innocent, purely medical, but Helena knew that explanation would sound like fantasy to a town consumed by fear and grief. White women simply did not consort with Comanche warriors, not even for healing purposes. Sheriff Brady stepped closer to her cell. Helena, I'm going to ask you straight out, have you been meeting with Indians? Helena met his gaze directly, knowing that her answer could determine whether she lived or died in the next few minutes. "Yes," she said quietly, "but not for the reasons Captain Morrison suggests." Brady's face went pale. Outside, the crowd had heard her admission, and their shouts grew louder, more threatening. Someone threw a rock at the jailhouse window, and Helena heard the glass crack. "Jesus, Helena," Brady muttered. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because I knew how it would sound," Helena replied. "Tom, I met with one wounded warrior and helped heal his injuries. We exchanged medical knowledge, nothing more. I would never betray this community." But her explanations were drowned out by the crowd's fury. Morrison had stepped back into the street and was consulting with his men, 3 cavalry troopers who had ridden in with him. Helena could see them checking their weapons, could hear fragments of conversation about securing the prisoner and preventing mob justice. "Citizens," Morrison called out again, his voice cutting through the noise. "I understand your desire for immediate justice, but I'm taking Miss Cross to Fort Richardson for interrogation. My commanding officer wants to know everything about Comanche movements in this region, and this woman clearly has information we need." "Like hell you are." This from Frank Garrett, whose grief had turned to rage. "We're not letting that murderer leave this town alive. She killed my boy, Captain, and she's going to pay for it, here and now." Several voices echoed Garrett's sentiment, and Helena could see the crowd beginning to surge toward the jailhouse. Morrison's 3 troopers raised their rifles, but they were vastly outnumbered by angry townspeople who had nothing left to lose. "None, Sheriff Brady," Morrison said sharply. "I'm ordering you to surrender the prisoner to military custody immediately." "This is still my jurisdiction, Jake," Brady replied, his voice carrying a warning note. "The woman hasn't had a trial yet. She'll get her trial a military tribunal." Morrison's hand moved to his gun butt, a subtle but unmistakable threat. "Unless you want to explain to Colonel Mackenzie why you obstructed an investigation into Indian conspiracy." Helena watched the confrontation between the 2 men, understanding that her fate was being decided by forces beyond her control. Outside, the crowd was growing more agitated by the moment, their grief and fear crystallizing into murderous intent. It was then that the first gunshot rang out. The sound came from the hills east of town, followed quickly by war whoops that raised every hair on Helena's neck. Through the cracked jail window, she could see dust clouds rising from the direction of the Henderson Ranch, could hear the distant sound of cattle scattering in panic. Comanche raid. Someone shouted from the crowd, and immediately the mob's focus shifted from Helena to this new threat. Men who had been calling for her death moments before were now running for their horses and weapons. Morrison was already barking orders to his troopers. "Carson, take 2 men and scout the Henderson place. Williams, get word to Fort Richardson. Tell them we have coordinated Indian attacks in the territory." But Helena was staring at the dust clouds with growing horror and understanding. She recognized those hills intimately from her herb-gathering expeditions. More importantly, she knew that Natan's band never raided from that direction, and they always approached from the north, following the creek bed that provided cover and water for their horses. "To Captain Morrison," she called out as he prepared to mount his horse. "Those aren't Natan's people attacking the Henderson Ranch. His band ranges north of here toward the Brazos. If there's raiding from the East Hills, it's a different group entirely." Morrison paused, his boot already in the stirrup. "How do you know so much about Comanche movements, Miss Cross?" Before Helena could answer, a second wave of shots echoed from the hills closer this time. The remaining crowd began to scatter in earnest, now parents calling for children, men running for their own weapons. The immediate threat to Helena's life had been replaced by a threat to the entire community. "We'll continue this conversation when I get back," Morrison told her grimly. "Brady, lock her up tight and post guards. If she's innocent, the Comanche won't care about rescuing her. If she's guilty... He left the threat unfinished, spurring his horse toward the sound of gunfire. Left alone with Sheriff Brady, Helena sank onto the narrow cot in her cell. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of the timing. Morrison was right about one thing: the raid's timing was suspiciously convenient. But not in the way he imagined. "But," she said quietly, "I think someone is using that raid to distract attention from what's really happening here." Brady was cleaning his rifle, but he paused to look at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, someone wants everyone focused on Indian attacks, instead of asking the real question: who is actually poisoning Milbrook's children, and why?" The sheriff resumed cleaning his weapon, but Helena could see he was listening carefully. "You're saying the raid and the poisonings are connected?" "I'm saying the timing is awfully convenient for whoever the real killer is," Helena replied. "While everyone's out chasing Comanche warriors, he's free to cover his tracks, maybe even plan his next move." As afternoon wore into evening, reports trickled back to town. The Henderson ranch had been burned, but the family had escaped to their root cellar. A dozen cattle had been run off, but no one had been killed. Most importantly for Helena, several witnesses confirmed that the raiders had been Kiowa, not Comanche, identifiable by their distinctive war paint and the way they rode their horses. But this distinction was lost on most of the townspeople, for whom all Indians were simply hostiles to be feared and fought. The raid had only confirmed their worst suspicions about Helena's guilt and the dangers she represented to their community. Dr. Hayes came to see her as the sun set, carrying his medical bag and wearing the expression of a man wrestling with profound doubt. At 41, he looked older than his years after decades of frontier medicine. His brown hair showed gray streaks that hadn't been there when Helena had first started working with him, and his gentle hands, the same hands that had delivered so many of Milbrook's children, now trembled slightly as he settled into the chair Brady had provided. "Helena," he said quietly, settling his medical bag on the floor, "I've been thinking about this situation all day, and I need you to tell me the truth. All of it." Helena met his gaze directly, seeing the pain of a man who had trusted her and now questioned everything he thought he knew. "Marcus, what do you want to know?" "The medicine you've been giving the sick children, I need to know exactly where you got those formulas." The question struck Helena like a physical blow. She had been dreading it all day, knowing it would come, eventually, knowing she had no good answer that wouldn't confirm Morrison's suspicions about her connection to the Comanche. "My grandmother taught me the basics," she said carefully, "in Kentucky before I came west, but I've adapted the formulas based on what grows here in Texas." Hayes nodded slowly, but his eyes remained troubled. "Helena, I've been thinking about the symptoms these children showed before they died. The convulsions, the foam at the mouth, the way their pupils dilated." He paused, choosing his words with medical precision. "It's not consistent with any childhood illness I know, but it is consistent with alkaloid poisoning." Helena's heart began to race. "Alkaloid poisoning, Marcus? Are you suggesting that someone deliberately—" "I'm telling you what the symptoms indicate." Hayes interrupted. "Someone has been giving these children concentrated plant toxins, probably derived from Jimson weed or a similar source." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Helena, if you've been experimenting with native plants, if you've made some mistake in dosage or identification, I would never experiment on children." Helena's voice cracked with emotion. "Marcus, you know me. We've worked together for 2 years, saved lives together. How can you even think I would harm a child?" Hayes was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the dim light, filtering through the barred window. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of medical authority combined with personal anguish. "I don't think you would harm anyone intentionally, Helena. But frontier medicine is dangerous work. We're all operating with incomplete knowledge, using plants and compounds we don't fully understand. Mistakes happen, even to the most careful practitioners. This wasn't a mistake, Helena said firmly, leaning forward to grip the cell bars. Marcus, someone is deliberately poisoning those children, and they're using my medical practice as cover. Think about it. Who else has access to the families? Who else could introduce poison without arousing suspicion? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Helena could see the moment when a terrible possibility began to form in his mind. You're suggesting another medical practitioner is involved, he said slowly. But Helena, there's no one else in Milbrook with your level of knowledge about plant medicine. I'm the only formally trained doctor, and I haven't been treating those children directly. I've been relying on your assessments and treatments. Helena leaned closer to the bars, her voice urgent. Marcus, what if it's not about medical knowledge? What if someone is simply adding poison to medicines I've already prepared, or contaminating water sources while I'm making my rounds, or... She stopped suddenly, a new and horrible thought forming in her mind. What is it, Helena? What are you thinking? But before she could answer, the sound of approaching horses filled the night air. Through the window, Helena could see torches moving down the main street, could hear the angry murmur of voices that had grown more organized and determined during the hours since the raid. They're coming back, she whispered, fear clawing at her throat. Marcus, the crowd is returning, and they're going to be angrier than before. The raid will have confirmed everything they believed about Indian conspiracies. Hayes stood quickly, his face pale in the approaching torchlight. Helena, I don't think I can stop them if they're determined to. Then don't try to stop them. Helena interrupted, a desperate plan forming in her mind. Help me escape. The suggestion shocked them both. Hayes stared at her as if she had suggested murder, while Helena herself couldn't believe the words had left her mouth. But as the angry voices grew closer, as the reality of frontier justice became undeniable, she knew it was her only chance at finding the truth. I can't ask you to risk yourself for me, she said quickly, seeing the conflict on his face. But Marcus, if I die tonight, the real killer will never be caught. More children will die, and this town will tear itself apart with suspicion and fear. Hayes looked toward the window, where the torchlight was growing brighter and the voices more distinct. She could hear Morrison's voice among them, now returned from the raid, and clearly addressing the crowd about what he had found. What would you do? Hayes asked, finally, his voice barely audible. Where would you go? I need to find Natan, Helena said. He's the only person who might understand what plant could cause these symptoms, and he might know who else has access to Comanche plant knowledge. You want to run to the Indians? Hayes's voice rose in disbelief. Helena, that will only confirm everyone's suspicions about you. Everyone already believes I'm guilty, Helena replied. At least with Natan, I'll have a chance to investigate the truth instead of dying for crimes I didn't commit. The debate was settled by the sound of boots on the jailhouse steps. Sheriff Brady's voice could be heard trying to reason with the crowd, but he was clearly outnumbered and outgunned. Helena could hear Morrison's voice above the others, describing the burned ranch and calling for justice for our murdered children and our threatened community. Hayes made his decision quickly, pulling a small key from his vest pocket. I convinced Brady to let me examine you for signs of witchcraft, he said, his cheeks reddening at the lie. I told him you might be hiding evidence on your person. He unlocked the cell door. There's a window in Brady's office that faces the alley. It leads to the space behind Miller's store. Helena stepped out of the cell, her legs shaking with gratitude and terror. Marcus, thank you. I swear I won't forget this. Don't thank me yet, he said grimly, pressing a small vial into her hand. This is laudanum, enough to help with pain if you're injured, but not enough to be dangerous. And Helena, if you're wrong about this, if you really have been making mistakes with your medicine, then I'll come back and face the consequences. Helena promised. But I'm not wrong, Marcus. Someone in this town is killing children, and I'm going to find out who. As the crowd's voices reached fever pitch outside, Helena slipped through the office window into the cold desert night. Behind her, she could hear Hayes telling Brady that he needed more time for his examination, that the prisoner was being uncooperative. The deception would buy her perhaps 30 minutes before the ruse was discovered. She moved through the shadows behind the buildings, heading for Murphy's stable where she had left her horse. Star was a tough little mare, bought from a retiring cavalry officer and trained for desert travel. If Helena was going to survive in hostile territory, she would need a horse that could handle heat-rough terrain and long distances without water. Murphy's stable sat at the eastern edge of Milbrook, close to the hills where Helena had always gathered her medicinal plants. As she approached, she could see light in the stable owner's window, could hear the soft sounds of horses moving in their stalls. She would have to be careful. Murphy was a light sleeper and kept a shotgun by his bed. But as she crept closer to Star's stall, a hand fell on her shoulder. "Going somewhere, Miss Cross?" Helena spun around to find herself face to face with Captain Morrison. His uniform was dusty from the day's activities, and his eyes held a satisfaction that chilled her to the bone. Behind him stood 2 cavalry troopers, their rifles held at ready position. "Captain," Helena said, forcing her voice to remain calm despite the hammering of her heart. "I was just running away to your Comanche friends." Morrison's smile was cold and knowing. "Did you really think we wouldn't post guards around the town, that we wouldn't anticipate exactly this kind of escape attempt?" Helena's mind raced, looking for options. The stable was isolated, surrounded by open ground that offered no cover. The troopers were young and nervous, the kind of soldiers who might shoot first and ask questions later. But surrender meant certain death, either from a rope or from the mob's fury. "My Captain Morrison," she said carefully, backing slowly toward Star's stall. "I understand why you suspect me, but I am not your enemy. The real killer is still in Milbrook, probably celebrating while everyone focuses their anger on me." Morrison stepped closer, close enough that Helena could see the grief and rage burning in his pale eyes. "You killed my niece," he said quietly, his voice more terrifying for its controlled calm. "You looked her mother in the eye, promised to heal her precious daughter, and then fed her poison like she was a sick animal to be put down. Captain, I know you're in pain." "Pain?" Morrison's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Miss Cross, you have no idea what pain is. Pain is watching your sister collapse when she sees her daughter's body. Pain is knowing that while you were out chasing phantom Indian raiders, the real enemy was walking free in your own town." Helena continued backing toward the horse, her hand slowly reaching for Star's halter. "Then help me find the real enemy," she said. "Help me prove that someone else—" "Enough!" Morrison snapped, drawing his revolver. "You're coming back to town, and you're going to face justice. The only question is whether you walk back or get dragged." It was then that the war cry split the night air. The sound came from directly above them, from the stable roof, where a figure had been waiting in complete silence. Natan dropped into the middle of the group, like a hunting cat, his knife flashing in the moonlight. One trooper went down immediately, clutching a wounded arm and screaming in pain, while the other stumbled backward in shock. Morrison spun toward this new threat, but Helena was already moving. She grabbed Star's halter from the stall, swinging the leather strap like a weapon to knock the captain's gun aside. The revolver discharged harmlessly into the stable roof as Morrison cursed and tried to regain his balance. "Helena, go!" Natan shouted in his broken English, grappling with the second trooper. "Take horse ride now." Helena vaulted onto Star's bare back, her years of frontier riding serving her well. The mare responded instantly to her heels bolting from the stable into the desert night. Behind her, she could hear Morrison shouting orders, could hear the wounded trooper calling for reinforcements from the town. But Natan was right behind her, running alongside her horse with the tireless pace of a warrior, trained from childhood for exactly this kind of escape. When they reached the first line of hills, he whistled sharply, and his own horse appeared from the shadows, a paint stallion that seemed to emerge from the desert itself like a spirit made flesh. "Why did you come?" Helena called to him as they rode deeper into the Badlands, following paths invisible to white eyes. "Why risk yourself for me?" Natan was quiet for a moment, his English limited, but his meaning clear when he finally spoke. "You heal my body when arrow poison try to kill Natan. Now Natan heal your spirit when white man poison try to kill Helena. Is fair trade, yes. Despite everything, the terror, the exhaustion, the knowledge that half the territory would soon be hunting them, Helena found herself smiling. "Fair trade," she agreed. They rode through the night, following ancient paths, known only to Comanche scouts and the occasional army patrol brave enough to venture into hostile territory. Natan led them through arroyos and around mesas, always heading deeper into the land his people claimed as their own. As dawn approached, they finally stopped at a hidden spring surrounded by ancient cottonwoods. "Safe here," Natan said, dismounting and leading his horse to water. "My people come when sun is high." Helena slid down from Star, her legs shaking from exhaustion and reaction. The events of the past 24 hours seemed like a nightmare, but the ache in her muscles and the fear still clutching her heart reminded her that it was all too real. "Natan," she said as they sat beside the spring sharing water and jerky from his supplies. "The children who died in Milbrook, I think someone used plant poison to kill them. Someone who knows about desert plants, maybe someone who learned from your people." Natan's face grew serious. He understood more English than he could speak, and the implications of her words were clear. "You think Comanche teach white man poison plants?" "Maybe not directly," Helena said. "But someone has knowledge they shouldn't have. Someone who can identify which plants are deadly and how to prepare them." She paused, studying his weathered features. "Natan, has anyone else from your band been meeting with whites trading information or medicine?" The warrior's expression darkened. "No. Is forbidden by Running Wolf, our war chief. Only Natan speak with white medicine woman, and only for healing knowledge." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "But other bands? Maybe different choice. Maybe some Comanche take white man's gold for plant secrets." Before Helena could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears. Natan rose quickly, his hand moving to his knife, but then relaxed as he recognized the riders. A group of 6 Comanche warriors emerged from the scrub brush, their faces painted for war, their horses snorting and stamping from hard riding. The leader was an older man, perhaps 50, with graying hair, braided with eagle feathers and scars that spoke of many battles survived. His weathered face was stern as granite as he dismounted and approached their small camp. When he spoke to Natan in rapid Comanche, his tone was sharp with what sounded like criticism and concern. Helena couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Natan was being questioned about bringing a white woman to their territory, about risking the safety of his people for someone from the enemy race. The conversation continued for several minutes, growing more heated as other warriors joined in their voices, rising in what sounded like heated debate. Finally, Natan turned back to Helena, his face troubled. "War Chief Running Wolf angry," he said. "Says Natan bring great danger to people. Says white woman maybe spy for blue-coat soldiers, maybe lead them to our camp." Running Wolf stepped forward, studying Helena, with eyes like black flint that seemed to see straight through to her soul. When he spoke, his English was better than Natan's, accented but clear and carrying the authority of absolute command. "White woman," he said, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. "My warrior says you heal sick, says you speak truth about children dying. But why should Running Wolf trust words of white woman? Your people lie like coyotes, speak with forked tongues, make promises they break like dry sticks." Helena rose to her feet, meeting the war chief's gaze directly. She had treated enough frontier men to know that showing fear would be interpreted as guilt, that her only chance lay in projecting strength and absolute honesty. Running Wolf. She said, "I don't ask you to trust me because I am white. I ask you to trust me because I have proven myself to Natan through actions, not words. And I ask for your help because innocent children are dying while the real killer remains free to continue his work." The chief's expression didn't change, but Helena could see him weighing her words with the careful consideration of a man whose decisions affected the survival of his people. Finally, he said, "How does helping white women serve Comanche people? How does it help our children, our families?" Helena took a deep breath, knowing she was about to reveal information that could change everything, information that could either save her life or guarantee her death. "Because I don't think the children are being killed randomly, and I don't think the killer's goal is simply murder. I think someone is trying to start a war between whites and Comanche by making it look like Indians are responsible for the deaths." A murmur ran through the group of warriors, and Helena could see surprise and interest replacing suspicion on several faces. Running Wolf remained silent, but his flint-hard eyes had sharpened with attention. The timing of the Kiowa raid yesterday was too convenient. Helena continued. Someone wanted the townspeople angry and scared, ready to blame all Indians for everything that goes wrong. If children keep dying and people keep blaming Comanche, how long before the army decides to take permanent action against your band? Now, Running Wolf's expression shifted, showing the first hint of genuine interest rather than mere suspicion. "You think a white man kill white children to make soldiers fight Comanche?" "I think it's possible," Helena said. "And I think if we can prove who's really responsible, we can prevent that war before it destroys both our peoples." The war chief was quiet for a long moment, consulting with his warriors in their own language. The debate was intense but brief, conducted in the rapid guttural syllables of Comanche that sounded like poetry and war songs combined. It ended when Running Wolf raised his hand for silence. "We help you find truth," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a momentous decision. "But if you lie, if you bring blue-coat soldiers to our people, you will die slowly and with great pain. This Natan knows. This you must know also." Helena nodded, understanding the deadly seriousness of the threat. "I accept those terms. I accept the risk." "Good," Running Wolf said. "Then we begin hunt for truth. Tell me about poison plants. Tell me who in your town might know Comanche medicine." As Helena began to explain what she knew about the children's symptoms and the likely source of the poison, a plan began to take shape in her mind. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was the only way to expose the real killer and prevent the war that someone was so determined to orchestrate. The sun was fully up now, painting the desert in shades of gold and red that reminded Helena of blood and fire. Somewhere to the east, the people of Milbrook were discovering that their prisoner had escaped, were probably organizing pursuit parties and calling for army reinforcements. Helena had perhaps a day, maybe two, before the full weight of territorial law enforcement came down on her hiding place. But she also had something her enemies didn't expect: allies who knew the desert as intimately as she knew the human body, and who had their own compelling reasons for wanting to prevent a war that would end in the destruction of their people. The hunt for truth was about to begin, and Helena Cross was no longer running away from her accusers. She was preparing to run toward them, armed with knowledge that could either save her life or guarantee her death. As Running Wolf's warriors prepared for what he called a different kind of raid, Helena found herself thinking of the children who had died: Sarah McKinnon, Tommy Preston, the Miller twins, little Thomas Garrett. Their deaths had been terrible enough, but the thought that they might have been murdered to serve someone's political agenda made the crime even more heinous. "I'm coming," she whispered to their memory, her words carried away by the desert wind. I'm going to find out who killed you, and I'm going to make sure they answer for it. But first, she had to survive long enough to uncover the truth. And in the harsh landscape of the Texas frontier, where survival was never guaranteed, and justice was often decided by the fastest gun that was far from certain. 3 days later, Helena Cross rode back into Milbrook at high noon, but she did not come alone. The sight that greeted the townspeople was unlike anything they had ever witnessed on the American frontier. Helena rode at the front of the procession, mounted on Star, and wearing clothes that marked her transformation, her own riding skirt and boots, but combined with a decorated leather vest that identified her as being under Comanche protection. Her long brown hair was braided with eagle feathers and glass beads, and her sun-darkened skin bore the temporary tattoos that marked her as a friend to Running Wolf's band. Behind her rode Natan and 4 other warriors, their faces painted not for war, but for the solemn ceremony of justice. They carried no weapons except for knives, and their horses bore symbols of peace, white cloths tied to their bridles and sage bundles fastened to their saddle horns. But it was what they carried that made the townspeople stop in their tracks and stare in amazement and fear. Stretched between 2 poles like a travois for carrying wounded was a canvas-wrapped body, obviously that of a white man. Even from a distance, people could tell this was not an Indian victim, but someone from their own community. The entire population of Milbrook seemed to emerge from buildings and side streets as the unprecedented procession made its way down Main Street. Helena could see a mixture of emotions on familiar faces: fear, anger, confusion, and something that might have been desperate hope. These were people who had known her for 3 years, who had trusted her with their children's lives, who now saw her as either a traitor or their salvation. At the jailhouse, Sheriff Brady waited with Captain Morrison and a full squad of cavalry troopers. All had their weapons drawn, and Helena could see the barely controlled tension in their postures, the urge to open fire on what they perceived as an invasion force. Helena Cross. Morrison's voice carried across the silent street when the group was still 50 yards away. You are under arrest for murder conspiracy and treason against the United States. Order your Indian allies to leave immediately, or we will consider this an act of war. Helena raised her hand, signaling for her companions to halt. Then she dismounted slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the hushed street. Captain Morrison, Sheriff Brady, people of Milbrook. She began. I have returned to face the charges against me and to present evidence that will clear my name and reveal the true killer of your children. A murmur ran through the crowd, but Morrison's voice cut through it like a saber. Evidence? The only evidence here is your guilt confirmed by your obvious alliance with hostile savages. These warriors are not hostile. Helena replied calmly, gesturing toward her Comanche companions. They have helped me discover the truth about the poisoned children, and they have helped me bring you the real murderer. She pointed toward the canvas-wrapped body. The man we carry was found dead in a hidden camp 20 miles east of here. In his belongings, we discovered the poison that killed your children, along with detailed plans for escalating violence between whites and Comanche. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by morbid curiosity despite their fear. Dr. Hayes pushed through the throng, his medical bag in hand, and his face showing a mixture of relief and apprehension at seeing Helena alive. Who is it? Called out Martha McKinnon. Sarah's mother, her voice thick with grief and desperate hope. Who's under that canvas? Helena looked directly at Morrison, watching his face carefully as she spoke. Someone who had access to sick children, who could introduce poison without arousing suspicion, who had detailed knowledge of both military operations and Indian movements. She paused for maximum effect. Someone who has been playing both sides against each other for months, orchestrating this entire crisis for personal profit. Morrison's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. Stop the theatrics, Helena. Show us this supposed evidence. Helena nodded to Natan, who began to unwrap the upper portion of the body with ceremonial care. As the canvas fell away, gasps and cries of shock rose from the crowd. The dead man was Sergeant William Dutch Morrison's own aide-de-camp and most trusted subordinate. Dutch. Morrison stared at the corpse in apparent shock, his composure cracking for the first time. "But that's impossible. He's been with my unit following orders, helping coordinate the search for you. Helping to cover his tracks," Helena corrected. Sergeant Dutch had been meeting secretly with hostile Kiowa bands, not to prevent raids, but to arrange them. He was also diverting Army medical supplies, including the alkaloid compounds he used to poison the children. From the crowd came Frank Garrett's anguished voice. "Dutch, but he came to Tommy's funeral. He stood right there and offered his condolences while I was burying my son." Running Wolf stepped forward, producing a leather pouch from his saddle with grave dignity. "White soldier came to enemies of Comanche people," he said in his careful English, each word chosen for maximum impact. "Offered much gold for attacks on white settlements. Promised more gold when Blue Coat Army comes to make war on all Indians." The war chief's weathered face was stern as judgment itself. "We find his hidden camp, find his poison bottles, find his papers written in white man's words. All proof is here." Helena took the pouch from Running Wolf, opening it, to reveal several glass vials, official documents, and a collection of gold coins that glinted in the harsh noon sun. "Dr. Hayes," she called to her former colleague, "would you examine these compounds? I believe you'll find they match the alkaloid signature you identified in the children's symptoms." Hayes approached reluctantly, his hands shaking slightly as he took the vials. The crowd watched in tense silence as he examined the contents, his medical training evident in the careful way he handled the dangerous substances. Dutch had access to all the affected families through his position with the Army. Helena continued her explanation while Hayes worked. He often accompanied Captain Morrison on courtesy visits to bereaved families, offering military protection and assistance. It would have been simple for him to contaminate water sources or food supplies during these visits. But why? The question came from Martha McKinnon, her voice breaking with grief and confusion. Why would he kill our babies? What could possibly justify murdering innocent children? Helena's expression softened as she looked at the bereaved mother, feeling the weight of every parent's anguish in the crowd. Because he was being paid by mining interests who want this territory cleared of Indians and open for development. A war with the Comanche would require massive military intervention, which would drive the Indians from their traditional lands and open up mineral-rich areas for corporate exploitation. She pulled out a set of documents from the pouch, holding them high for all to see. These are correspondence between Dutch and representatives of the Consolidated Mining Corporation. They show payments totaling over $4,000 for what they euphemistically call territorial pacification services. Morrison had been silent during Helena's revelations, but now he stepped forward to examine the documents himself. As he read, his face grew darker, his hands beginning to shake with what might have been rage or grief or both. "Son of a bitch," he whispered, then louder, his voice carrying across the silent street. "Son of a bitch." He looked up at Helena, his eyes bright with unshed tears and terrible understanding. "He was my sergeant for 5 years. I trusted him with classified information with my own family's safety." His voice broke. He stood at Sarah's graveside, Helena. He stood there while my sister wept over her daughter's coffin, and he knew, God help him, he knew he had murdered her. The crowd was processing this shocking revelation with difficulty. People who had been ready to lynch Helena just days before were now grappling with the reality that the true killer had been someone they trusted, someone who wore the uniform of their protectors. It was then that Dr. Hayes straightened up from his examination of the chemical compounds, his face grim with scientific certainty. Helena's right, he announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of medical expertise. These vials contain concentrated alkaloids consistent with the toxins I found in the children's bodies. This is definitely the source of the poison that killed our children. A woman near the back of the crowd screamed. We almost hanged an innocent woman. While a man shouted in rage, "Where's Dutch now? Let's make him pay." Dutch is beyond earthly justice. Running Wolf said solemnly, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. He died fighting like a cornered wolf when we found his camp. But his death does not restore life to children, does not heal wounds between our peoples. Helena stepped forward, sensing the crucial moment of her plan. This was when she would either succeed in creating something unprecedented or fail and watch both communities destroy each other in senseless violence. That's why I've come back, she said, her voice rising to carry to every person in the crowd. Not just to clear my name, but to propose something that has never been tried in this territory. A formal peace agreement between Milbrook and Running Wolf's band based on shared knowledge and mutual protection against those who would exploit us both. The suggestion created an immediate uproar. Voices rose in heated argument, some supporting the radical idea while others rejected it as impossible or treasonous. Morrison raised his hand for silence his authority, as military commander still carrying weight despite the day's earth-shaking revelations. You're talking about negotiating a treaty with Indians, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of military protocol. Miss Cross, I don't have the authority to make formal agreements with native bands. Running Wolf's people have never been our enemies, Helena replied firmly. The raids you've been responding to were carried out by Kiowa bands paid by Dutch to create the appearance of Comanche aggression. The real Comanche in this region have been as much victims of this conspiracy as we have. Running Wolf nodded confirmation, his weathered features showing the dignity of a leader who had seen too much warfare. Dutch soldier promised Kiowa warriors many rifles, much gold if they make war signs near white settlements. Kiowa take white man's payment, make raids to frighten settlers, then disappear to northern hunting grounds. Leave Comanche people to face white man's anger and blue-coat soldiers' guns. Morrison studied the war chief with new eyes, perhaps seeing him as a fellow leader rather than simply an enemy for the first time in his military career. You're saying my own sergeant orchestrated the raids that killed Henderson's cattle, burned the Miller homestead, terrorized our community, all planned by Dutch soldier? Running Wolf confirmed with grave certainty. He want white people angry like wounded bear, want army to come with many soldiers and big guns. Make great war, drive all Indians from lands rich with yellow metal that makes white men crazy with greed. The crowd was struggling to process this revelation, to understand that 3 years of frontier tension and fear had been manufactured by one of their own supposed protectors. Helena could see the mixture of relief and rage on faces throughout the crowd, relief that the threat was ended, rage at how thoroughly they had been deceived. But it was then that Dr. Hayes stepped forward with an expression of profound anguish on his weathered features. There's something else you all need to know, he said in a voice that carried across the silent street. Something about my own role in this tragedy. Every eye turned to the town's physician, who removed the leather glove he always wore on his left hand. Gasps rose from the crowd as they saw the distinctive scarring that marked old Burns' burns in a pattern that every frontier dweller recognized. Gunpowder burns. Sheriff Brady said immediately, his voice tight with growing understanding. But Doc, you told everyone those came from a medical accident. Hayes looked at Helena with gratitude and resignation, understanding that she had given him this opportunity for redemption. Because I knew Helena would eventually piece together the truth, and I was afraid of what people would think. His voice grew stronger as he continued. 3 years ago, I was the Army surgeon attached to Captain Morrison's unit during a planned raid on a Comanche winter camp. But I wasn't participating in the attack, I was trying to prevent a massacre. The crowd stirred uneasily, not fully understanding the implications. Helena stepped forward to provide context. Dr. Hayes learned about the planned attack 3 days before it was scheduled to happen, she explained. He rode ahead to warn the Comanche families, giving them time to escape. He was wounded by his own side when he tried to protect their children from cavalry sabers. Running Wolf approached Hayes with recognition, dawning on his weathered features. "You are Medicine Man who saved my granddaughter at Willow Creek," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You pulled her from Burning Lodge, carried her to safety, while blue-coat soldiers killed her mother and grandmother." Hayes nodded, tears flowing freely down his cheeks as the memory returned in vivid detail. "I should have spoken up earlier. Should have told this community about the connections that already existed between our peoples, about the good that was possible when we chose cooperation over conflict. You speak truth now." Running Wolf replied, simply extending his hand in the gesture of respect between equals. "Sometimes courage comes slowly, but it still comes. This is what matters." Helena watched this exchange with deep satisfaction, seeing another crucial piece of the foundation for peace being laid. But she knew that one more revelation was necessary to cement the alliance she envisioned, one that would show both communities how thoroughly they had been manipulated. "There's something else," she said, drawing everyone's attention back to her. "Something about why Dutch chose the specific children he targeted." She opened Dutch's journal to a page marked with a strip of leather. Dutch didn't select his victims randomly. "Look at this list he kept Sarah McKinnon, daughter of a woman who had been secretly providing food to hungry Comanche families during the harsh winter. Tommy Preston, son of a man who had been quietly trading with Running Wolf's people for winter supplies and medical knowledge. The Miller twins, whose father had been advocating for peaceful coexistence in town council meetings." Morrison studied the journal with growing horror, his military mind quickly grasping the strategic implications. He was systematically eliminating the families most likely to support peace with the Indians. "Exactly," Helena confirmed. Dutch understood that his war couldn't succeed if too many people in Milbrook were sympathetic to the Comanche. So he murdered the children of families who might have opposed military action, making their deaths so traumatic that even peaceful families would demand bloody revenge. The psychological manipulation was staggering in its calculated cruelty. Dutch had not only murdered innocent children, he had specifically targeted those whose deaths would cause maximum trauma to the families most likely to work for peace between the communities. But he made one crucial mistake. Helena continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. He underestimated the power of truth and the willingness of good people from both communities to work together when they understood what was really happening. She gestured to the unprecedented gathering of white townspeople and Comanche warriors standing together in Milbrook's main street. Dutch assumed that racial hatred was stronger than human decency, that fear was more powerful than compassion and justice. He was wrong. Captain Morrison looked around at the faces of his community people who had been manipulated into near catastrophic hatred, who were now seeing the possibility of something unprecedented on the American frontier. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Cross?" he asked, his voice carrying new respect for the woman he had been prepared to execute just days before. "A formal compact." Helena replied, her words carefully chosen for their historic significance. "Running Wolf's warriors will provide intelligence about genuine hostile activity in the region, raids by Kiowa or other aggressive bands that threaten both white and Comanche settlements. In return, Milbrook will provide medical supplies and treatment for Indian families and will guarantee safe passage through this territory for peaceful purposes." And who would oversee such an unprecedented arrangement? Sheriff Brady asked, his practical mind already working on the details of implementation. Helena looked at Dr. Hayes, then at Running Wolf, then back at the crowd of townspeople who held the future of both communities in their collective decision. A council of 3, Dr. Hayes representing medical cooperation and shared knowledge. Running Wolf representing Comanche interests and traditional wisdom, and myself representing the bridge between our peoples that makes such cooperation possible. The suggestion created another stir in the crowd, but this time the voices were more thoughtful than angry, more curious than hostile. Helena could see people weighing the unprecedented nature of her proposal against the practical benefits it might provide for their family's safety and prosperity. It was then that a small voice spoke up from the edge of the crowd, a child's voice, clear and determined and unafraid. I think we should trust them. Everyone turned to see young Billy Preston, the 10-year-old brother of one of Dutch's victims. He stepped forward with a fearless directness that only children possess, his young face, serious but unafraid, as he looked up at the adults surrounding him. The Indian people helped catch the bad man who killed Tommy. Billy said, his childish voice carrying more wisdom than many adult speeches. Miss Helena didn't hurt nobody, even though we all said she did. Maybe grown-ups don't always know who's good and who's bad. The child's words carried a weight that no adult argument could match. Helena could see the effect rippling through the crowd faces, softening defensive postures, relaxing the rigid categories of us and them, beginning to blur into something more human and hopeful. Sheriff Brady was the first adult to respond, his weathered features showing something that might have been hope. The boy's got a point, he said slowly. We were wrong about Helena, wrong about the Indians, wrong about damn near everything that mattered. Maybe it's time to try something different. One by one, other voices joined in support. Samuel Peters, the blacksmith, whose massive arms had once gestured toward Helena's window in murderous rage, now spoke up for giving peace a chance. Mary Hutchinson, the schoolteacher who had been teaching children to fear Indians, acknowledged that manufactured fear had nearly destroyed their community. Captain Morrison looked around at his community, seeing consensus building despite the unprecedented nature of the decision they were being asked to make. The military commander in him recognized the strategic wisdom of the proposal, while the uncle who had lost his niece to corporate greed saw the moral necessity of preventing future tragedies. Finally, he turned to Running Wolf, with the formal bearing of one leader addressing another. War Chief, he said with newfound respect, if I were to propose such an alliance to my superiors at Fort Richardson, would your people be willing to send representatives to witness the agreement and ensure its terms are honored? Comanche Council of Elders will hear proposal with open hearts. Running Wolf replied, his words carrying the weight of tribal authority. If terms are fair to both peoples, if promises are kept like sacred vows, maybe other bands join peace. Maybe we end long war that serves only men hungry for gold and power. Helena felt a surge of triumph, but she knew the moment was fragile. Agreements made in the heat of crisis had a way of falling apart when normal life resumed, and old prejudices reasserted themselves. She needed something more permanent, more binding than words spoken in the emotion of the moment. There's one more thing, she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. To make this alliance work, to ensure it survives changes in military command or shifts in public opinion, we need to create something lasting. Something that will remind future generations why this peace was necessary and worth preserving. She gestured toward the spot where Dutch's conspiracy had nearly succeeded in destroying both communities. I propose we build a memorial garden on that site. A place where white and Comanche children can play together, where the names of Dutch's victims are remembered with honor, and where the story of how peace was chosen over war is preserved for all time. The suggestion resonated deeply with the crowd. Parents who had nearly lost their children to poison, who had nearly lost their community to manufactured hatred, could see the profound value in creating something beautiful from something terrible. Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his voice strong with newfound purpose. I'll donate the medical supplies for the Alliance's first year, he declared. And I'll train anyone who wants to learn white or Comanche in frontier medicine and the healing arts that can serve both our peoples. Running Wolf nodded approvingly, his weathered features showing something that might have been satisfaction. Comanche women teach white women about desert plants, about medicines that grow in this harsh land and nowhere else. We share knowledge that heals instead of knowledge that kills and destroys. As the formal discussions continued and the practical work of building peace began, Helena found herself approached by Martha McKinnon, Sarah's mother. The bereaved woman carried something wrapped in a piece of her daughter's baby blanket, her eyes red with tears, but no longer filled with the consuming hatred that had nearly destroyed her. "I want you to have this," Martha said, unwrapping a small wooden cross that had been carved with childish hands. "Sarah made it for you last Christmas, but after she got sick, I couldn't bear to give it to the person I thought had killed her." Helena took the cross with trembling hands, feeling the rough edges where a 7-year-old girl had worked with loving care to create something beautiful for her healer. The simple gift meant more to her than any formal recognition ever could. "Martha, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll help make sure no other children die the way Sarah did." Martha replied, her voice thick with emotion, but strong with resolve. "Say you'll help make this peace work so our kids can grow up without fear, without hatred, without the poison that nearly destroyed us all." "I promise," Helena whispered, clutching the wooden cross against her heart. "I promise with everything I am." As the day progressed and the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the practical work of implementing the new alliance began in earnest. Captain Morrison dispatched riders to Fort Richardson requesting official recognition of the compact and informing his superiors of Dutch's conspiracy. Sheriff Brady began the painstaking work of documenting everything that had happened, creating a complete record that would serve as both legal evidence and historical testimony. But it was the sight of children that moved Helena most deeply. By late afternoon, white and Comanche children were playing together in the dusty street, sharing games and laughter despite the language barriers between them. Adults from both communities watched with wonder and growing hope, seeing something they had never thought possible on the harsh American frontier. Running Wolf approached Helena as evening shadows began to lengthen across the transformed town. "Medicine woman," he said in his careful English, "my people have special words for what you accomplished today. You are what we call bridge walker, one who can cross between worlds that others think cannot be crossed, who can help others make that crossing as well." Helena smiled at the title, finding it more meaningful than any formal recognition she might receive from government officials. "And what do your people call someone like you who was willing to risk everything for peace?" "Peacemaker." Running Wolf replied simply, his weathered features showing quiet pride. "Is highest honor among Comanche people? Higher than war chief, higher than medicine man, higher than any warrior title. Such leaders are remembered in tribal stories as long as children have children to tell them to." As night fell over, Milbrook Helena stood once again in the spot where her ordeal had begun. But now it was transformed beyond recognition. Instead of an auction block or gallows, the space was marked by the beginning of the memorial garden. White and Comanche women had already begun planting desert flowers, their hands working side by side in the rich soil that would nourish new life from the ashes of tragedy. Dr. Hayes approached his medical bag slung over his shoulder and his step lighter than it had been in years. "Helena," he said quietly, "I need to ask your forgiveness for doubting you, for not trusting what I knew in my heart to be true about your character." Helena touched his arm, gently feeling the weight of shared redemption. "Marcus, we all made mistakes born of fear and incomplete understanding. What matters is that we found our way back to the truth and that we're committed to building something better from what we've learned." "What will you do now?" he asked. "Will you stay in Milbrook, or will you feel the need to move on to somewhere without these painful memories?" Helena looked around at the transformed community white families, welcoming Comanche visitors into their homes, children playing together, regardless of race, adults working together to build something unprecedented on the American frontier. "I think I'm needed here," she said with quiet certainty. "Not just as a healer of bodies, but as someone who can help heal the divisions that keep communities apart, the fear and mistrust that make people vulnerable to those who would exploit them." Natan approached from the shadows where he had been tending the horses, his wounded arm now properly bandaged by Dr. Hayes and healing well. "Medicine woman?" he said. "My people prepare to return to our camp tomorrow, but we leave scouts here, warriors who will watch for real dangers, who will help if troubles come to either of our peoples." "What kind of troubles?" Helena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Dutch soldier was not working alone in this evil. Natan replied seriously, his broken English carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Mining company still wants this land for digging yellow metal. They will send other men try other ways to start the war they need for their profits." Helena nodded grimly, understanding that their victory was just the beginning of a larger struggle against those who would profit from conflict and division. "Then we'll be ready for them, all of us working together." As the Comanche warriors prepared to depart the next morning, a ceremony was organized to formalize the alliance that would change the course of frontier history. It combined elements of both white and Indian traditions, a written agreement signed by official representatives, but also the exchange of sacred gifts and the sharing of food that marked meaningful relationships in Comanche culture. Running Wolf presented Captain Morrison with a beautifully crafted peace pipe, its stem decorated with intricate beadwork and eagle feathers. "This made by our finest craftsmen for this day only," he explained through Helena's translation. "Will be kept at Soldier Fort as sign of friendship between our peoples, reminder that war is choice, not necessity." Morrison, clearly moved by the significance of the moment, presented Running Wolf with a military saber, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of respect between warriors who had chosen the harder path of peace over the easier path of continued conflict. But it was the children who provided the most moving moment of the ceremony. Led by young Billy Preston and a Comanche girl about Sarah McKinnon's age, they presented drawings they had made during their day of playing together, pictures of white and Indian families living in harmony, of children sharing toys and games of a future where the color of one's skin mattered less than the content of one's character. "This is what we're really building," Helena said quietly to Dr. Hayes as they watched the children present their artwork. "Not just an end to war, but a beginning to something unprecedented, a community where differences are celebrated rather than feared." Hayes nodded, his weathered features softened by something approaching wonder. "Helena, in all my years of frontier medicine, I have never seen anything quite like this. You've accomplished something that politicians and generals declared impossible. You've shown that supposed enemies can become genuine friends when they understand the truth about each other. We accomplished it," Helena corrected, gently encompassing the entire community in her gesture. "All of us working together, despite our fears and prejudices. And it's not finished yet. This is just the beginning of what's possible when good people choose courage over comfort." As the formal ceremonies concluded and people began to disperse to their evening meals and normal routines, Helena found herself standing alone with the wooden cross Sarah McKinnon had made for her. It was a simple thing carved by a child's hands, with more love than skill. But it represented something profound, faith that survived, even in the face of senseless loss. Hope that endured, even in the darkest moments of despair. The memorial garden would bloom with desert flowers, tended by hands both white and red, a living testament to the power of truth over deception, of courage over fear, of love over hatred. In its thriving plants and playing children, the spirit of Sarah McKinnon and the other innocent victims would live on, not as symbols of division and vengeance, but as reminders of what was possible when good people chose to stand together against the forces that would tear them apart. Helena Cross Bridgewalker Between Worlds had found her true calling at last. Not just as a healer of bodies, but as a healer of the human spirit, helping to mend the broken places where fear and hatred had taken root, and replacing them with understanding cooperation and hope for a better future. The wooden cross would rest in a place of honor in her home, a daily reminder of the child whose death had catalyzed transformation, whose innocent faith had helped light the way from darkness into the dawn of a new kind of community. And every time Helena looked at it, she would remember that even in the harshest places, even in the most desperate times, love could triumph over hate, truth could overcome lies, and ordinary people could choose to do extraordinary things. The frontier had been forever changed by what happened in Milbrook, and Helena Cross had been the catalyst for that change. Bridgewalker, peacemaker, healer of both body and spirit, she had found her purpose in helping others find theirs, in showing that the divisions between people were not as deep or as permanent as they seemed when viewed through the lens of fear and prejudice. As the stars emerged in the vast Texas sky, Helena Cross slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, surrounded by a community that had chosen peace over war, truth over lies, and hope over despair. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats from those who profited from division and conflict, but tonight all was well in the little town that had learned to love instead of hate to heal, instead of harm to build, instead of destroy. The memorial garden would bloom with the coming spring, and children would play there without knowing that the color of each other's skin had once mattered to anyone. It was a small victory in the vast scope of the American frontier, but it was complete and it was real. And it would endure as long as there were people willing to remember why it mattered. Helena Cross had kept her promise to the children who died, and in keeping it, she had helped create something beautiful and lasting, something that would make their sacrifice meaningful for generations to come. The bridge between worlds had been built with blood and tears and unshakable determination, and it would stand as long as there were people willing to cross it, willing to see past their differences to the common humanity that united them all. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything that mattered in a world where love was always more powerful than hatred, where truth was always stronger than lies, and where the choice between building and destroying remained forever in the hands of ordinary people with extraordinary courage.